that person. And you know as well as I do, of the thousands of people who die every day, the majority of them know not Christ. So the first, we see the wrath of God on display every day in eternal wrath. The second way is through what is called end times wrath, or eschatological, you have to write that, but eschatological wrath or end times wrath. The Bible describes that towards the end, the wrath of God will be poured out on all the earth. Now, we don't see the wrath of God being poured out yet, but what we do see is we see the events that are leading towards this beginning to happen. As we grow as a world closer and closer to the time when Jesus returns, we grow closer and closer to the time when the world will be seeing a strong shifting away from God. 2 Timothy 4 and verse 3, "For the time is coming when the people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths." Isn't that what I read to you at the beginning? These ministers, we want to tickle your ears. We want to make you happy. We want to please you. We want you to leave in as much sin as you can, but feeling good. We see this in our time as people constantly clamor for ministers who tell them what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. And this is setting the stage for the wrath of God, which will be poured out in the end. The third one I think is most interesting to think about, and that's what's called consequential wrath. Every one of us has experienced this. Consequential wrath. Every sin has built within it consequences. God doesn't just have a wrath that He sends down as a lightning bolt every time we do something wrong. But what He does have is He has built within those things that we do a natural consequence. I didn't just make this up. It's Galatians 6:7. It says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will reap from the flesh corruption. We get what that's saying? There are actions that we do which have built-in consequences in them. He's liking the idea of sowing and reaping. You cannot sow watermelons and expect to get squash. You can't take watermelon seeds, put them in the ground, and grow squash. It doesn't happen. Likewise, you can't sow a lifetime of drunkenness and then be surprised when you find out your liver is destroyed. You can't sow a lifetime of sexual immorality and then be surprised when you contract the disease. Actions have consequences. Sinful actions have wrathful and consequences. This is what Paul means, and I want to show you this in Romans 1, just very quickly. It says in verse 18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men." Hold your place there, and I want you to jump down to verse 26. Verse 26. "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged the natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another," speaking of homosexual activity, "men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error." Note that the person who lives in sexual perversion receives in themselves the penalty. And this is confirmed in the massive variation of disease that is found within the community of those who choose to live in sexually perverse lifestyles. It is interesting that God sets up a natural wrath to befall sin. He institutes consequences to go with sinful actions. Did you know the government itself is an instrument of the wrath of God? Romans 13, don't laugh. Romans 13. says that the government, it says that the governing authorities are the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. The government is put in place to bring God's bearing down upon those who do wrong. And we all appreciate that. You may say, how do we appreciate it? Because if any of us went home tonight and somebody broke into our front door, we want to be able to pick up the phone and dial 911. We appreciate the fact that the police will come and remove that person from our home. We appreciate the fact that judges don't let murderers, rapists, and drug pushers go. Now I realize that government in many ways has problems. Government in many ways is broken. But at the same time, let us not forget Romans 13, which tells us that God has assigned the government of the world, the governments of the world, in their place to be an instrument of His wrath. The consequential wrath that I'm talking about. Finally, and I'm not going to spend much time on this because I am going to be going through verses 18 through 20, through 32 in the weeks to come, but I do want to mention this. It's the fourth type of wrath. You have the wrath of eternal wrath, you have the wrath of end times wrath, you have the wrath of consequential wrath, and number 4, the wrath of abandonment. Look at Romans 1 again. Look at verse 24. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts. Now go to verse 26. For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Now go to verse 28. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind. Anytime the Bible says something more than once, pay attention. Anytime it says something over and over, pay close attention. There's an idea that God is trying to get into our minds. And this is the idea. God will passively and actively remove the restraint of sin on a person's heart. It's not the creation of fresh evil, but it is the removal of restraint and allow that person to go headlong into sin. And that's what it means when it says God gave them up. It is a statement of the removal of restraint. Other places in the Bible say this, and you've probably heard this and wonder what it means. You've heard the Bible say, God hardened their hearts. Does that mean God made them more evil than they already were? He didn't need to. Because we are by nature children of wrath. Hardening of the heart is not creating fresh evil within someone's soul, but it is removing the grace of restraint. God restrains every one of us from the sin we are capable of. And in removing of the restraint, He gives them over to what they desire. And in doing so, they go headlong into sin. And you see this as you read through Romans 1, 18 through 32. People do things that are utterly detestable, and God gives them over to even worse things. They do the worst things, and God gives them over to the even worse things. And finally, the whole thing decrescendos into a downward spiral of debauchery, which ends with verse 31, which is envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliceness, gossip, slander, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil. They making it up. Disobedient, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless.